Since the creation of the American Republic, the Founding Fathers had desired and coveted a system that believed in separation of powers, a balance, and an independent judiciary, one that would not be a political entity occupied by politicians, but by jurisprudence and wisdom. However, from the onset, some of the most important figures, such as John Jay, the first Chief Justice, were indeed political figures, with Jay being active in Federalist politics before his ascension to the nation's highest court. The bench was supposed to be independent, but it proved early on that it could review and strike down laws that it deemed unconstitutional or uphold laws that they deemed to be constitutional. The question of judicial activism and politics entering the judiciary was an issue that far outdated the lifespan of Jay being the Supreme Court Chief Justice. It continues to be an issue to this day within the modern Supreme Court, many of the justices being politically active but not being politicians. Perhaps the most famous example of this was the only man to ever be the U.S. President and the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, William Howard Taft. Taft started off as a judge and Solicitor General of the United States who did not want to become president but wanted to be the Chief Justice. However, his close association with the extremely popular Theodore Roosevelt made him a shoo-in when he was selected as Republican presidential nominee in 1908. Under pressure from both Roosevelt and his wife Nellie, Taft accepted and became president easily. However, Roosevelt eventually double-crossed him, believing that he had not fulfilled the progressive agenda. This split in the Republican vote in 1912 led Woodrow Wilson to an easy election, and Taft, who you can see in this picture is really bummed about his loss, left office not in disgrace but in joy. Eventually he would be back, ascending to the nation's highest court, becoming the Chief Justice in 1921, a position he desired, the only man to ever swear in a president who had been sworn in himself as president. Taft's legacy, though, with the Supreme Court and the activity of politicians continues. When Taft died in 1930, Herbert Hoover needed to find a new Chief Justice. He recommended an Associate Justice, Charles Evans Hughes. Hughes had been a politician himself, running against Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and leaving a position as an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court in order to do so, a position that he had been nominated for in 1910 by William Howard Taft, the same man who 20 years later he would succeed, becoming Chief Justice until 1941. Solicitation is a common road for politicians, and Hughes was no different. A lawyer, he had become the governor of New York in 1907 before rising to the Supreme Court 3 years later, leaving to run for president and returning 15 years after that. History could have been significantly different had Hughes won against Wilson in a very close re-election campaign in 1916. However, this pattern of Republican politicians ascending to the nation's highest court continued with Earl Warren, who left the governorship of California early in his second term in order to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, having not been a judge before under Dwight Eisenhower in 1953, and serving on the nation's highest bench till 1969, overseeing the famous Brown versus the Board of Education ruling of 1955. Political associations and governorships may have made the founders turn over in their grave, but it did not prevent Charles Evans Hughes, who blocked much of FDR's overreach with the New Deal from being an effective Chief Justice, nor did it block the Warren Court from its effectiveness, nor did it block William Howard Taft from lobbying for a Supreme Court building while serving during his tenure. Taft also promoted judicial independence. The former judge who turned politician turned back to being a judge and firmly laid in that camp until his death in 1930. At the end of the day, the independent judiciary ideal may squirm, thinking of politicians and even former presidents sitting on the nation's highest court and helping to dispense jurisprudence. However, many would argue that today's judges, with far less political experience, are twice as politically motivated and activist as William Howard Taft, the former president. Perhaps in Taft, Hughes, and Warren, Americans can learn that sometimes politicians serve better on the court than judges do when they get involved in politics.